Hi again. A couple of weeks ago, it was the anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe, where we commemorated the end of hostilities in Europe. And you can imagine what it must have been like on that day when people then realised that their loved ones would be safe. Their fathers, husbands, brothers, sons, overseas fighting in the armed services or in other capacities. And likewise, the soldiers were worried about the people at home. And it was then all over. As the celebrations went on, there was a new book published which covered this very subject called Victory 45, and it covers the surrender which was the start of the celebrations for VE Day. And the book was written by Al Murray and James Holland. Now, I've reviewed Al Murray's book previously. He wrote Watching War Films with My Dad, and he's always been a fan of military history, and he trained, his degree was in history, and he also speaks German, so he's got a very, very good grasp. Obviously, he's very, very well known as a comedian, a tremendously funny comedian. James Holland, another historian, very serious historian, written numerous books on various campaigns, and I reviewed his book on the Dams raid, which was excellent. And he also regularly appears on TV. And the two of them are very good friends, and they do a podcast called We Have Ways of Making You Talk. And recently that podcast, it quite often has guests on who've written books or who are experts in various areas of interest. But they did a kind of a sub-series where they walked the ground of Arnhem and traced the battle in all its phases. Absolutely fascinating. Anyway, I'm not really aware of a book specifically covering the surrender, so it was very interesting. And the first thing that took me by surprise was there were actually 8 surrenders. The various forces in various geographical locations surrendered over a period of time. So what I'll talk about principally are some of the personalities involved, but I'll just set the scene. The book starts in the bunker with Hitler realizing that it's all over and he's lost, and his dream of European domination, probably world domination, has come to nothing. And he writes his will, blames everyone but himself, and says that the German people don't deserve him. So at the same time, he's accusing quite a few people of being traitors. Now, this is a very interesting part, because today there are still people who have, to say the least, Nazi sympathies, who are neo-Nazis in various parts of the world. I don't think they're a very significant threat. They're more of an odd bunch of crackpots, basically. But with the internet, they're quite vocal. Even if you take their belief system on board, when you look at the history, you realise that it was built on a foundation of sand, that the top Nazis themselves were not really convinced of this, and weren't willing to fight to the end, and sought to get in the good books of the Allies. So Goering, who was one of the original Nazi Party members, he was deemed a traitor by Hitler. Likewise, Himmler, True Heinrich, Hitler used to call him, loyal Heinrich. He was condemned, and a warrant issued for him because he was negotiating with the Allies. Hermann Fegelein, who was married to Eva Braun's sister. He was a senior SS officer, came up in the SS cavalry, and he was arrested, dragged back to the bunker and executed. So really, out of the whole gang, the most loyal was Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, and possibly Martin Bormann, because we don't really know what was on his mind. He was always scheming, but he certainly was there to the end. Goebbels killed, or had his children killed by his wife. They poisoned 8 children and then committed suicide. Bormann headed out to the Weidendammer Bridge, which was the escape route, but at the Lehrter Bahnhof, the station, he was hit by shell blast, and he never got any further. And his body was there since 1945, despite all the reports that he was seen in various places such as Argentina. It's been proven by DNA. He died right then. So that sets the scene. So one of the early chapters is the duel, and it concerns two very, very senior. In fact, they were both the second highest SS officers jointly. Karl Wolff, who was the highest SS officer in Italy. He'd been put in charge there. And Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who was in charge of the RSHA, the security headquarters. So he was in charge of the SS, SD, Gestapo, SIPO, etc. The whole policing of oppression of the state. Now, both of them were absolutely drenched in blood. They were evil war criminals who had been heavily involved in the slaughter of not just the Jews, but many of the population in the Eastern Bloc and in Western Europe as well. And both of them were trying to negotiate with the Allies, basically through Alan Dulles, who was CIA, OSS, later CIA officer based in Switzerland. And but as they were negotiating, Kaltenbrunner was trying to have Wolff arrested and brought. He was actually brought before Himmler and told to explain himself, and he managed to wriggle out of it. And at the same time, Himmler was trying to negotiate, and basically they were all looking. They knew that they were likely to face the death penalty, and they were looking for ways of mitigating that and getting in the good books of the Allies. The Nazi system was based on this duality thing, where they'd have two people doing the same job, so they would be rivals of each other and then not threaten the position of the guy above them. Okay, some of the personalities I mentioned, and first of all is Field Marshal Montgomery, Monty. Now, previously, Al Murray gave him rather short shrift in his book, and also he wrote a really good book on the commanders, and he enumerated Monty's faults, which is fair comment. He was egotistical. He lacked diplomacy in dealing with his American counterparts, for example, and he was pig-headed. But his soldiering ability and his conduct of the battle, at the end of the day, you've got to say that his leading 21st Army Group from D-Day right across over the Rhine and into the Reich, and he did a really good job. So he comes out of it well. He was very, very heavily involved, busy, workaholic, etc. Led quite an austere life. He didn't, sort of wine and dine much. Kind of Spartan existence, but he was the instrument of bringing the surrender at Lüneburg Heath of the local or the whole area of the German forces, and he negotiated that, and he gave the German generals and the admiral very short shrift, and barked at them and so on, and really let them, he told them their fortune, let them know that the Allies were now in command. So that really was a very significant surrender. Then we come to General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, Ike. And in the pen portrait of him, he comes across as a very, very skillful leader, but who was under tremendous pressure. The book doesn't really cover D-Day, but it covers it in as much as Ike's role in it. And as is well known now, everything depended on the weather, and I took a gamble. The experts were saying there's probability the weather's going to be terrible, but he did get reports that there's possibility of a break, and he gave the go. Had he not done that, it would have been delayed for another at least a month. Higher death toll, possibly the plans leaked, etc. So decisiveness is a very prized virtue of a general, and he was decisive. But obviously this weighed on him, the tremendous responsibility. But D-Day was a success. The beachhead was established, and the armies are pushing inwards. And his troubles just pile up because he's balancing the egos and the demands of Patton, Bradley and Montgomery, and at the same time he has to answer to his own bosses, General Marshall back in DC, and ultimately to the president. So he really had a lot of balls in the air, and he didn't need any additional problems. But anyway, following the Lüneburg, the total surrender, and this is a point that at the earlier conferences between the leaders, it had been decided, Churchill, FDR and Stalin, that we were going to demand unconditional surrender of the Germans. There's going to be no partial or kind of a stand down or an uneasy truce. No, going to be total total subservience, and we could do what we liked with their military forces and navy. So it was decided that General Jodl would come in to Ike's headquarters with his entourage and sign the surrender document. And the Soviets were on hand, and the British and so on, and it was the Allied effort. But Ike refused to witness the actual signing. He kept himself above the fray in that regard, and then only afterwards would he meet the Germans. One of the things, going back to Karl Wolff in Italy, he was trying to get a surrender done, and it was almost a couple of weeks previously he could have had it done, except that the Wehrmacht, the army, had this oath. They'd been made to swear an oath personally to Adolf Hitler, and they wouldn't break the oath. And so even though the SS were willing to do it, the army weren't. So at the final European surrender at Ike's headquarters, they were trying to get concessions right to the end, and Ike put his foot down and said, no, none of this nonsense. You know, it's this or nothing. So the document is signed, and that is VE, Victory in Europe, and liberation of a lot of countries. However, there were a significant number of countries that were not liberated. They were under the Soviet boot, and it took a long time, it took decades for them to become liberated. And the writing was on the wall, really, with the rape of Berlin. The bestial Soviet troops were just out of control in a devastated city, and it's a terrible part of history. So we then switch the attention to the war in the Far East and the Pacific War against Japan, and a tremendously hard-fought war, principally fought by the United States Marines and the Navy and the various air arms of those forces, island hopping, taking each island, and it was bloody. The Japanese were tenacious fighters. They hated the idea of surrender. So that battle was continuing. And the mantle fell on Harry Truman. Now, Harry Truman was from the Midwest, from Missouri, and he didn't want to go into politics. He was a reluctant politician, and he was persuaded to accept the job as vice president to FDR, and he only did it out of a sense of duty to the country, doing his bit after the Depression. And in this day and age, it's rather refreshing to find people who are not actually seeking high office. And then FDR dies, and Harry Truman is now president. Again, it's something he hasn't sought, but he certainly stepped up to the job. And his personality, he was very quiet chap. And there's a story, it's not in this book, but his Secret Service detail leader, Mike Riley, was in the car with him, and the president says to him, Agent Riley, can I ask your first name? And he says, it's Mike, Mr. President. Would you mind if I call you Mike? That's the kind of guy he was. And then in comes Stimson, Secretary of State, with the details of the Manhattan Project, which was this tremendously secret and very expensive project to develop the atomic bomb, which even the vice president had been kept in the dark about. Of course, the Soviets knew all about it, but the vice president didn't. It's possibly one of the few secrets that the Americans kept, albeit not from the enemy. And he has to make this terrible decision whether to drop the bomb. And at the time, and I spoke to US Marines officers who were involved in the planning of the invasion of the home islands. And the battle for Okinawa was so intense, with the Japanese fighting to the bitter end and, in fact, committing suicide, going over the cliffs at Mabuni, rather than surrender or be captured. And the civilian population absolutely lay in the shattered buildings of Okinawa from the tremendous naval and aerial bombardment. And heads were scratched, and if they're fighting like this for Okinawa, how are they going to defend the home islands? And they really set out to kill millions of Japanese. That was the sober thing. And actually dropping the atomic weapon saved lives. I know it sounds obtuse, but without a doubt it did. It saved Japanese lives as well as American. So the book, obviously I'm just skimming. The book goes into details, fascinating parts of military history and also political history. The machinations of Stalin, for example. Really good book. I'll put a link to the podcast that the authors do. It's one I watch regularly, and I think you'll enjoy it. And I enjoyed the book, and I think you will too.